You can also alter when or how a task is performed, and allowing an individual to work from home or a remote location. You know, when the telework policies first came out a couple of years ago, there was a lot of kickback from employers and managers about that. But I've noticed over the last couple of years, everybody's teleworking. When I was working at the EEOC, when I started there, we had the regular computers, or PCs on the desk, and within about a year, they upgraded to laptops, and everybody was all excited about the fact that we all got these brand new laptops. What they didn't realize is now you have a laptop, you can take your work home with you, so that you are available to work at all times. So when the Air Force was shut down, or the base was shut down, and the government was shut down, how many of you were still teleworking? I know I was. Yeah, a couple of you were. That's telework. That's a reasonable accommodation for individuals with disabilities, but it's something we all benefit from. Okay, where are we at? Other common types of accommodations. Allowing an employee to use leave after their accrued leave is exhausted for disability-related needs, such as treatment for a medical condition, recuperation, or training. Sometimes an individual who might be getting a service animal, that requires 6 weeks of in-house training for that animal, and that individual may have to take leave, will have to take leave in order to attend that training. So providing them leave, either paid or unpaid leave, can be a reasonable accommodation. Modifying workplace policies. You know, sometimes it's hard to have a good example in the military culture, but in the private culture, there are a lot of policies about eating at your desk. You can't have food or drink at your desk, and I think it's probably because a lot of us used to spill things on our computers. I think we've all gotten better about that. For somebody who may have a condition that requires them to drink a lot of fluids because of the side effects of medication, or an individual who may have diabetes, who may have to eat more frequently, modifying that policy to allow them to eat at their desk or allow them to take more frequent breaks, that can be a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes the accommodation isn't the individual, it's the supervisor. Modifying supervisory method is specifically stated as a reasonable accommodation in EEOC guidances. Sometimes you have to change the way you supervise an individual as a reasonable accommodation. Best examples of doing that are providing more information or more guidance in writing. Provide the person with a checklist of things that they need to accomplish. Provide them directions by email as well as verbally. Sometimes changing schedules or switching to part-time employment is necessary for an individual with a disability, but always as a last resort, reassignment to a vacant position for which the individual is qualified is a reasonable accommodation. When you look at a lot of the, you probably don't spend a lot of time reading EEO complaints like I used to do, but employers are getting better about the reasonable accommodation part, but they miss the second part of that. If they can't accommodate the person in the position that they're in, they say, you know, we're sorry, we did all of these things, you're not able to do the job, here's the paperwork to fill out for your disability retirement. The part they missed was the reassignment part. The Rehabilitation Act and the ADA specifically say we have to consider reassignment to a vacant position if this individual is not able to perform the essential functions of their current position with reasonable accommodations. So be willing to consider reassignment for that individual. And just a word on hidden disabilities, especially when you're dealing with wounded warriors who may be coming back with disabilities such as traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are the type of injuries you're not going to be automatically aware of when somebody comes to work for you. Just be aware that the agency or you are only required to make a reasonable accommodation to a known mental or physical limitation of an individual with a disability who is qualified to do the job unless it would be an undue hardship. The key here is that you have to know about it. If I have a disability and I need an accommodation and I'm having trouble doing my job and I don't tell you that and it's not obvious to you, and I don't have an obvious disability, something that would be readily apparent, you're not obligated to provide me for reasonable accommodations that you're not aware that I need. So the requirement is specifically on the individual to tell you, I have this condition and I need a reasonable accommodation. We're going to talk more about the interactive process in a minute, but I just want you to be aware that you don't have to guess. I have to tell you, I have to make it aware to you in some way that I need something as a result of my medical condition or my disability. Once I've done that, then you're obligated to continue what's called the interactive process. But if I've never come to you and said I need an accommodation and we're starting to address my performance issues and we're going through a performance improvement plan or whatever you're trying to do to assist this person to meet those performance goals, and they never tell you they need accommodations, you're not obligated to provide them with something that you're not aware of that they need. So again, it's for known conditions. We're required to provide reasonable accommodations unless it would be an undue hardship. Remember what I said earlier is that saying I can't afford it or we can't afford that is the wrong answer. The reason that's the wrong answer is that undue hardship, financial undue hardship, is determined by the overall resources of the agency and the workplace operations. It's not just your budget, it's Air Force's budget. And Air Force, the last I heard, was like a $45 billion budget. I think we have the money for reasonable accommodations. We have to be smart about how we provide those reasonable accommodations. But the answer is never going to be we can't afford it. We have to find a way to afford it and find a way to make it work. Agencies, any agency, not just Air Force, but any agency is probably not going to be able to successfully assert that cost is a defense for not providing reasonable accommodation, since cost is going to be determined in light of the agency's entire budget. Agencies are always going to have the burden of establishing undue hardship. So when I come to you and say this person needs a reasonable accommodation, and you tell me we can't afford it, you're going to have to come up with a better reason than that, because it's not going to be based on financial resources. As a general rule, the individual with a disability who wants an accommodation is responsible for informing you that they need the accommodation, and I encourage people to use the Air Force's reasonable accommodation procedures to do that. So the next question is, I've come to you and said I need a reasonable accommodation. What do you do if you're my manager? Well, I usually start by saying don't panic. Okay? Take a deep breath. Call Kendra. It's okay. The whole point of me asking you for reasonable accommodation is to begin that interactive process so that we can determine what it is I need and what's the most efficient and effective way to provide that accommodation. So employers with the employer and the individual with a disability should engage in an informal process to clarify what the individual needs and identify the appropriate reasonable accommodations. That's the interactive process. Talk to the person about what they need and why. What do you have difficulty doing? How will this accommodation enable you to do this better? And you can ask specific questions relevant to their request for accommodation. What is that device? How does it work? How does that enable you to do this job task better? Those are all relevant and reasonable questions. You can ask what type of reasonable accommodation this person needs. At that point, you probably want to contact your disability program manager for assistance. So I have a question for you. If I ask you for an accommodation, do you have to give me the exact thing that I'm asking for? No. You, the manager, and probably with the input of your disability program manager, have the right to choose the accommodation. Our obligation is to provide effective, reasonable accommodations, not necessarily the accommodation you're asking for. So if I'm asking for $100,000 in equipment as a reasonable accommodation, and you've got a really good DPM and she can make that accommodation happen with a piece of equipment that only costs $2,000, you get to choose which one of those accommodations you're going to provide as long as they're both equally effective. So don't be concerned that because somebody comes to you with a laundry list of things that they need, and this usually includes ergonomic chairs, keyboards, that you're going to have to provide that exact that item. Work with your disability program manager to determine what's the most effective and reasonable accommodation for that individual.